The laughter started the moment my hands
Thank
touched the
you all
white
so much for
tablecloth.
coming tonight.
I
It
was
means the
sitting
world to
among
my mother and
million-dollar
me.
lawyers, investors, and people who wore watches worth more than my house when one of my son Daniel's friends stared at my fingers and asked, "What happened to your hands?"
My goodness, what
Another
rough
woman
hands
whispered,
you have,
"They
Mother.
look
Did you
frightening."
actually work
A
for a
few people
living?
laughed. My
That's
son lowered
that's
his
a funny
eyes.
joke,
He didn't
darling.
defend me.
Is she
At
actually
67
leaving?
years old, after 40 years of factory work, burned,
I can't believe he
skin-broken
just sat
joints, and
there.
sacrifices no one ever saw, the deepest pain was not their cruelty. It was watching my own son become ashamed of the hands that had built his entire life. As I stood to leave, an elderly man at the next table slowly rose to his feet and said, "Those hands saved lives, and every person in this room should be ashamed." If this story touches something in your heart, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Please like and subscribe, only if stories about family sacrifice and second chances mean something to you. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever hidden your pain for someone you loved? I would also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world tonight. My name is Sierra Patterson, and I am 67 years old. Most people notice my hands before they notice my face. The fingers are twisted slightly to the left. The skin across my knuckles is thick and uneven. There are patches of pale scar tissue running along my palms, and several of my joints no longer bend the way they should. The fingertips are rough, almost like sandpaper, and on cold mornings they ache so badly that holding a coffee cup can feel like carrying a stone. For many years, I learned to hide them. I wore gloves to church. I kept my hands under the table at restaurants. When strangers stared, I folded them quietly in my lap. But age eventually teaches you something important. You become too tired to keep apologizing for surviving. Still that night in Connecticut, sitting among people who had never known hunger, hard labor, or fear, I suddenly felt ashamed again. Not because of them, because my own son lowered his eyes. Daniel Patterson was the most beautiful thing I had ever created. When he was born, I was 26 years old and living in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio. The hospital room was tiny and the wallpaper was peeling near the ceiling, but none of that mattered. I remember holding him against my chest and whispering that I would give him everything I never had, and I meant it. I grew up in a family that knew hard work better than comfort. My father repaired farm equipment, and my mother cleaned motel rooms. We never went hungry, but we never had extra money either. Every dollar had a purpose before it even entered the house. By the time I turned 18, I had already accepted a job at the textile factory on the edge of town. The building was old even then. The machines were loud enough to make your ears ring long after your shift ended. But I was young. I thought life was beginning. Back then, my hands looked very different. My fingers were slender. My nails were painted light pink on weekends. I dreamed of becoming a teacher, maybe opening a small bookstore someday. I imagined a little white house, children running through the yard, and a husband who would grow old beside me. Life does not always ask permission before changing your plans. I met Michael Patterson at a county fair when I was 21. He was charming, funny, and handsome enough to make every girl turn her head. He worked construction and carried himself with confidence. He made me laugh. He made me believe that life could become bigger than the town we lived in. We married 2 years later. For a while we were happy. We rented a small house with green shutters and planted tomatoes in the backyard. Michael talked about opening his own business someday. I talked about going back to school. Then Daniel was born, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. I used to sit in the rocking chair at night, holding my sleeping son, listening to the soft sounds of the house. Michael would come home from work, covered in dust, kiss Daniel on the forehead, and tell me that we were building a good life. I believed him. When people ask when marriages begin to fall apart, they expect one dramatic answer. There usually isn't one. Sometimes it happens quietly. Bills arrive. Work becomes uncertain. Arguments last longer. Silences grow heavier. Dreams become expenses. Michael started changing after layoffs hit his company. He became frustrated, angry, and distant. He spent more time away from home. Sometimes he came home late. Sometimes he didn't come home at all. But at that time, Daniel was still little. He had bright blue eyes and asked 1,000 questions every day. He loved dinosaurs. He loved peanut butter sandwiches. He loved climbing onto my lap while I read stories to him. And he loved holding my hands. I remember one evening when he was 4 years old. I had just finished a long shift at the factory. My hands already carried small cuts and rough spots from years of sewing machines and fabric rollers. Daniel took my fingers in his tiny hands and said, "Mommy, your hands are strong." I laughed. "Why do you think that?" "Because they can fix everything." For years, those words stayed with me. Because children believe their mothers can fix everything. What they never realize is how many mothers are breaking while they do it. As Daniel grew older, I worked harder. I volunteered at school events. I attended baseball games. I baked cookies for class parties. I stayed awake helping with homework even after 10-hour shifts. I never wanted him to feel poor. I never wanted him to know how close we sometimes came to losing everything. When Daniel graduated from high school, I cried harder than anyone else in the auditorium. He had earned excellent grades. Teachers praised him. Scholarship offers arrived. He wanted to study law. The entire town seemed proud of him, and I was proudest of all. I still remember the first time he left for college. His old sedan was packed with boxes and blankets. I slipped $20 into his glove compartment because it was all I had left until payday. He hugged me quickly. "I'll make you proud, Mom." "You already have." And for many years he did. He graduated from law school. He moved to Manhattan. He joined a prestigious law firm. His salary became larger than any amount of money I had ever imagined. He bought expensive suits. He moved into a beautiful apartment. He started attending charity galas and corporate dinners, and somewhere along the way, our conversations became shorter. The phone calls became less frequent. Birthdays became rushed. Christmas visits became weekend visits. Weekend visits became excuses. At first, I told myself he was simply busy. Successful people work hard. Young people build careers. Life becomes complicated. But mothers notice things. I noticed how he changed the subject whenever I mentioned my factory years. I noticed how he never invited me to certain events. I noticed how uncomfortable he seemed when his colleagues called during our conversations. Once during a video call, one of his coworkers appeared behind him. "Who's that?" the man asked. Daniel hesitated for just 1 second. "My mother." Nothing more. Not "this is Sierra." Not "she's the reason I'm here." Just my mother. That single moment stayed with me for weeks. Still, I defended him. To neighbors, to friends, to myself. He's busy. He works hard. He lives far away. But sometimes, late at night, I would sit alone in my kitchen, stare at my scarred hands resting on the table, and wonder if success had carried my son so far upward that he could no longer see where he came from. The invitation to his birthday party arrived 3 weeks later, and I truly believed that perhaps we had finally found our way back to each other. I had no idea that those same hands my little boy once called strong would soon become the reason an entire room would laugh. There are moments in life when you can hear your future breaking. For me, that sound was not a scream. It was the soft click of our front door closing one rainy Tuesday morning in October. I was 30 years old. Daniel was 3. And Michael Patterson walked out of our house carrying a single duffel bag. At first, I thought he was going to work. He had been quiet for weeks. The layoffs at his construction company had become worse, and every evening he came home carrying more frustration than hope. Bills were stacking on our kitchen table. The mortgage was late. The truck payment had been missed twice. But that morning felt different. The house was silent. The coffee pot sat untouched. Michael stood near the door with his jacket already on. "Where are you going?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "I can't do this anymore." Those 6 words changed every year that followed. I remember Daniel sitting on the living room carpet pushing a small toy truck back and forth, while his father stood 10 feet away, preparing to leave him forever. I remember the rain against the windows. I remember my heart beating so hard I could hear it. "What are you talking about?" I said. Michael finally looked at me. His eyes seemed tired, empty. "I can't keep living like this, Sierra." "Living like what?" "Poor." The word felt like a slap. Poor. Not tired, not struggling, not overwhelmed. Poor. As if our family had become a burden too heavy for him to carry. "You have a son," I whispered. "I know." "You can't just leave." He looked toward Daniel for only a second. Even now, nearly 40 years later, I still remember that moment, because I think he had already left long before he walked out the door. "I'll send money when I can." He never did. He picked up his bag, opened the front door, and disappeared into the rain. The silence afterward was unbearable. Daniel looked up at me. "Daddy, go work." I could barely speak. "Yes, sweetheart." "When Daddy come home?" I lied. "Soon." Children believe promises. Mothers make them even when they know they are impossible. For several weeks, I kept waiting for Michael to return. I called relatives. I called old friends. Nobody knew where he was. Eventually, one of his cousins told me he had moved to another state with a woman he had met months earlier. By then, I had stopped crying. Fear had taken over. Because grief and panic cannot share the same room for long. 3 weeks later, the first collection notice arrived. Then another. Then another. I sat at my kitchen table after Daniel had gone to sleep and spread the bills across the surface. Mortgage payment overdue, credit card debt, medical bills, truck payment, utilities. The numbers seemed impossible. I earned barely enough money at the textile factory to cover groceries. Without Michael's income, we were drowning. I remember opening the refrigerator one evening. Half a gallon of milk, eggs, bread, a few slices of cheese. Nothing else. Daniel stood beside me. "Mommy, what's for dinner?" I smiled, because mothers smile at moments when their hearts are breaking. "We're having breakfast tonight." He clapped his hands. He thought scrambled eggs for dinner was exciting. I went into the bathroom afterward and cried quietly so he wouldn't hear me. The following month, the bank called. Then the mortgage company. I learned words I had never wanted to know. Foreclosure, repossession, collections, delinquency. Every conversation felt like another door closing. I stopped sleeping. At night, I sat beside Daniel's bed and listened to him breathe. His small hand would reach for mine, even while he slept. And every time, I made the same promise. I won't let you lose everything. One evening, my mother drove over after church. She found me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by bills. Sierra. I looked up. I don't know what to do. She sat beside me. You keep going. I can't. Yes, you can. I'm scared. She took my hands. Back then, they were already rough from years of factory work, but they had not yet become the hands people would someday laugh at. These hands can carry more than you think. I didn't believe her. Not yet. A week later, I met with my supervisor at the factory. I asked for extra shifts. He looked concerned. You've already been working 50 hours. I need more. We don't have enough daytime hours. I'll work nights. Sierra. I have a little boy. He nodded, and that was how my life changed. Factory during the day, cleaning offices in the evening, anything I could find afterward. I began living hour to hour. Coffee became breakfast. Sleep became a luxury. Some days I felt like a machine. Wake up, work, pick up Daniel, cook dinner, read stories, wait until he slept, go to another job, come home, repeat. The hardest part was pretending. Because Daniel was still so young, he asked questions every day. Where's Daddy? When's Daddy coming home? Did Daddy forget us? I always gave gentle answers. He loves you. He's far away. He'll call someday, but the calls never came. On Daniel's 4th birthday, I bought a small cake from the grocery store. Just the two of us sat at the kitchen table. The candles flickered. He closed his eyes to make a wish. What did you wish for? I asked. He smiled. I wish Daddy would come home. I had to turn away, because some pain is too large to let a child see. The next morning, I drove him to preschool. As he climbed out of the car, he looked back and said something that would stay with me forever. Mommy, don't be sad. I'll take care of you when I get big. Children say beautiful things, and mothers build entire futures around them. Years later, when Daniel became successful, I often remembered those words. I'll take care of you, but life changes people. Success changes people. Sometimes pain changes people. At the time, however, all I knew was that I had a little boy depending on me. I sold my wedding ring. I canceled every unnecessary expense. I learned how to stretch $10 into a week of groceries. I patched old clothes. I fixed broken appliances myself. And every night before falling asleep from exhaustion, I looked at my sleeping son and repeated the same promise. You will have a better life. You will never know this fear. You will never carry this burden. I didn't realize then that protecting him from my suffering would one day create a distance neither of us understood. Because while I was working desperately to save his future, Daniel was growing up without ever seeing the true cost. And my hands, the hands that would eventually become scarred, burned, and broken, were only beginning their long journey. The worst pain had not yet arrived. Neither had the fire. People often imagine sacrifice as one heroic moment, a soldier running into danger, a firefighter entering a burning building, a mother lifting a car to save her child. But most sacrifice happens quietly. It happens at 4 a.m. when no one is watching. It happens inside empty kitchens, inside old cars, inside aching bodies. And most of the time, the people you sacrifice for never see any of it. After Michael left, my life became divided into shifts. The factory owned my mornings, the office buildings owned my evenings, and exhaustion owned everything in between. Every weekday began at 4:30 a.m. The alarm clock would ring before sunrise. My body usually hurt before my feet touched the floor. I would quietly make coffee, prepare Daniel's lunch, and leave notes on the kitchen counter, reminding myself which bills absolutely had to be paid first. By 6 o'clock, I was already standing beside industrial sewing machines. The factory floor was always loud. Hundreds of machines, metal gears, needles moving so quickly they became invisible. The air smelled like dust oil and fabric. Many of the women there were mothers. Some were widows. Some had husbands who drank. Some carried bruises they tried to hide beneath long sleeves. We rarely complained. We simply worked. My supervisor, Helen, was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and tired eyes. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, "You're losing weight." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." I smiled. Mothers become experts at lying. The truth was simple. I had begun skipping meals. If there was enough money for one decent dinner, Daniel ate first. If there was enough milk for one glass, it went into his cup. Children grow. Mothers wait. Sometimes after putting him to bed, I would eat crackers and drink water before leaving for my evening cleaning job. I told myself it was temporary. Everything was temporary. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The office building downtown was nearly empty at night. I vacuumed carpets, emptied trash cans, cleaned conference tables where executives discussed deals worth more money than I could imagine. Sometimes I looked at the photographs hanging in those offices. Families smiling on beaches, college graduations, vacation homes. I wondered if those people had ever worried about electricity bills. I wondered if they knew what it felt like to count quarters for gasoline. When I returned home near midnight, Daniel would already be asleep. But every morning, he woke up smiling, and somehow, that made the entire day possible. One winter, our heating system failed. The repair estimate was nearly impossible for me to afford. For several weeks, the house remained cold. I bought extra blankets. I told Daniel we were camping indoors. He thought it was an adventure. We built blanket forts in the living room. We drank hot chocolate. We pretended. Children can survive difficult things if they feel safe, so I made sure he always felt safe. There were nights when I sat inside my car after work because I didn't have enough gas money to drive home immediately. I would wait until payday, calculate every dollar, and pray the engine would keep running. Once, after an especially difficult month, I fell asleep inside that car in the parking lot behind the office building. When I woke up, snow covered the windshield. For several minutes, I forgot where I was. I remember staring at my hands gripping the steering wheel. The skin had already begun to change, small cuts, calluses, dry cracks. I rubbed lotion into them whenever I could, but hard labor always wins eventually. At home, Daniel never noticed. He was entering elementary school by then. He loved science. He drew pictures of rockets. He wanted to become an astronaut one week and a veterinarian the next. One afternoon, his teacher called me. "Mrs. Patterson, Daniel won the reading competition." I was working overtime. I almost couldn't attend the ceremony, but I left the factory early. I still remember arriving in my work clothes. My hands smelled faintly of machine oil. My hair was tied back. I felt embarrassed standing beside parents who wore business suits. But when Daniel saw me enter the room, his entire face lit up. "That's my mom," he shouted. The pride in his voice nearly made me cry. Afterward, he handed me his certificate. "Did you see me? I wouldn't miss it for the world." Those moments carried me through the worst years, because outside those moments, life became harder. The roof began leaking. The truck needed repairs. Medical bills appeared after I injured my shoulder at work. Every problem seemed to arrive before the previous one had been solved. One evening, I opened my jewelry box. Inside sat my wedding ring. I had not worn it since Michael left. I held it in my palm for several minutes. That ring represented promises, dreams, a future that no longer existed. The following morning, I sold it. The money paid our overdue utility bills. When Daniel asked where my ring had gone, I smiled. I put it away. He nodded. Children accept simple answers. Years later, I would realize how many truths I had hidden from him. I hid the overdue notices. I hid the collection calls. I hid the tears. I hid the fear, because I wanted him to grow up believing the world was safe. Perhaps that was my mistake. One spring afternoon, I burned my hand while working extra hours in a restaurant kitchen. The pain was intense. The skin blistered. The manager told me to go home. I refused. I can still work. You need a doctor. I need the paycheck. I wrapped my hand and continued serving tables. That night, Daniel saw the bandage. What happened? Cooking accident. Does it hurt? A little. He gently kissed my fingers. Now it'll feel better. I smiled. But after he fell asleep, I sat in the bathroom and cried because the burn was far worse than I had admitted. Still, I reported to work the next morning. Because there was rent, because there were groceries, because there was school, because there was Daniel. As he grew older, he began noticing that I was always tired. One evening when he was about 10, he walked into the kitchen while I was rubbing my aching hands. Mom. Yes? Why do your hands always hurt? I looked down. The knuckles were swollen, the skin rough, the fingers stiff. I forced a smile. That's what happens when you get old. He frowned. You're not old. I laughed softly. Maybe not. He sat beside me. When I grow up, you won't have to work anymore. I touched his cheek. You just worry about school. I'll buy you a big house. And what color will this house be? Blue. Blue. Because you like the sky? Sometimes children say things that become anchors during difficult years, and I held on to those promises. Not because I expected them to happen, but because they reminded me that everything I was enduring had a purpose. I never wanted Daniel to carry my burdens. I wanted him to carry books, dreams, opportunities, hope. What I didn't realize was that by hiding every hardship, I was also hiding the truth about who I was. My son grew up seeing a mother who somehow made everything work. He never saw the nights without food, the tears in empty parking lots, the fear of losing our home, the woman falling asleep at the kitchen table, the hands slowly being destroyed, one shift at a time. And perhaps that was why years later, when wealthy strangers stared at those same hands with disgust, Daniel himself could not understand what he was looking at. Because I had spent decades protecting him from the very sacrifices that built his life. Children do not notice the exact moment their world becomes larger than their parents. It happens slowly. A new school, new friends, different dreams, different conversations. And one day, the child who once reached for your hand begins walking several steps ahead. Daniel was 13 when I first realized he possessed something I never had. Confidence. Not the kind that comes from money, the kind that comes from possibility. He was brilliant. His teacher said it. The principal said it. Even people who barely knew him could see it. He read constantly. History books, biographies, newspapers, anything he could find. While other boys spent entire summers playing baseball, Daniel sat at our kitchen table discussing politics and asking questions that I sometimes couldn't answer. One evening, he placed a newspaper article in front of me. Mom, Do you know what a lawyer does? I smiled. They argue a lot. He laughed. No, seriously. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel. They help people. He nodded. I think I want to become one. I looked at him carefully. At 14 years old, his face was already beginning to resemble his father's, though his eyes had always been mine. A lawyer. A really good one. Why? He thought for a moment. Because nobody can push lawyers around. That answer stayed with me. Perhaps he had seen more of our struggles than I realized. Perhaps children always see more than parents believe. From that moment forward, Daniel became even more determined. He joined debate clubs, he earned excellent grades, he studied late into the night. Sometimes I would wake up at 2 a.m. and find his bedroom light still on. You need sleep. So do you. I smiled. Neither of us listened. Money remained a constant problem. College brochures began arriving during his junior year of high school, and each one seemed to carry a price tag larger than my yearly income. I hid my fear. Daniel noticed anyway. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. I can stay local. No. It's cheaper. No. Mom, you are going wherever your future takes you. He looked down. I know how much things cost, and I know how smart you are. He reached for my hands. By then, the calluses had become permanent. Small scars crossed several fingers. The joints sometimes swelled after long shifts. You're working too much. I'll survive. He frowned. I don't want you doing this forever. I squeezed his fingers. Then become the man you're supposed to become. The scholarship letter arrived in April. Daniel had been accepted into a university outside Columbus with financial assistance. Not enough, but enough to make the impossible seem possible. I still remember the day he opened the envelope. He shouted so loudly that our neighbor came outside to check on us. Mom, I got it. I cried before I even read the letter, because hope sometimes arrives on ordinary paper. The months before he left for college were bittersweet. I wanted him to leave. I feared him leaving. Both things were true. The night before move-in day, we sat on the porch. Summer insects filled the darkness. Neither of us said much. Finally, Daniel spoke. You've done enough. I looked at him. What does that mean? It means when I graduate, you're done working. I laughed softly. Life doesn't work like that. It will. I wanted to believe him. God knows I wanted to. College changed him. Not immediately. At first, he called constantly. He described his professors, his roommates, his classes. He asked for recipes. He complained about laundry. He missed home. I loved those calls. But as semesters passed, the calls became shorter. His vocabulary changed. His interests changed. He began talking about internships, networking events, law schools, career opportunities. Words I had never used. Words from a world I had never entered. After graduation, he was accepted into law school in New York. The day he called me, I nearly dropped the phone. New York, can you believe it? No, he laughed. I can't either. I was proud, terrified, and quietly lonely. Because New York felt farther away than the moon. His first apartment in Manhattan was tiny, but to me it sounded glamorous. He talked about courtrooms, professors, firms, partners. I listened carefully. Sometimes I didn't understand half of what he was describing, but I understood one thing. My son was climbing. Years later, he joined a prestigious law firm. The salary he mentioned made me sit down. He bought expensive suits. He attended charity dinners. He worked with wealthy clients. His voice became more polished. His schedule became impossible. And somewhere along the way, our conversations changed. Instead of talking for an hour, we talked for 10 minutes. Instead of calling every Sunday, he called every few weeks. Sometimes I left messages. Sometimes he answered days later. Sorry, Mom. Busy week. It's okay. And it was okay. Until it wasn't. The first time I visited New York, I felt completely out of place. The buildings seemed impossibly tall. The restaurants were expensive. People walked quickly, spoke quickly, lived quickly. Daniel met me outside his office. He looked handsome, confident, successful. Everything I had prayed for. Yet something felt different. When coworkers passed us on the sidewalk, he introduced me politely. This is my mother. Not Sierra, not the woman who worked 3 jobs, not the woman who sold her wedding ring. Simply my mother. At first, I thought I imagined the distance. Perhaps I was being emotional. Perhaps all mothers struggle when children become adults. But little moments began adding up. He stopped asking about my work. He changed the subject when I talked about the factory. He rarely visited Ohio. Holidays became complicated. One Thanksgiving, he canceled 2 days before arriving. A case, an emergency meeting, a client. I sat alone at the kitchen table eating leftovers for 3 days. Christmas became another missed visit, then another. Still, I defended him. Friends asked questions. He works hard. He lives far away. He has responsibilities. All true, but there was another truth I didn't say aloud. He had built a new world, and I no longer knew whether I belonged in it. One evening, during a video call, I noticed expensive artwork hanging behind him. His apartment had changed. He looked different too, more polished, more distant. A woman's voice spoke from another room. Who are you talking to? My mom. A beautiful young woman appeared briefly on the screen. Blonde hair, elegant clothes, confident smile. This is Olivia, Daniel said. She waved politely. Nice meeting you. Then she disappeared. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room. I wasn't upset. Not exactly. I simply realized that my son's life now included people who had never known places like our little town. People raised differently. People with different expectations, different backgrounds, different hands. Months later, Daniel finally mentioned Olivia again. Her family lives in Connecticut. Oh, they've done very well. I smiled. I'm happy for you. And I was. I truly was. But mothers sometimes hear things hidden beneath words. I began wondering whether Daniel talked about me. Did he mention the factory? The years after Michael left, the sacrifices, the scars? Or had those stories become embarrassing pieces of his past? Then one afternoon, after nearly 8 months without seeing him, my phone rang. Mom. Daniel. My birthday is next month. Yes. I'd like you to come. My heart stopped. Really? We're having a dinner in Connecticut. I smiled so hard my face hurt. Of course I'll come. There'll be friends there. Wonderful. And Olivia. I'd love to meet her properly. There was a pause, a very small pause. You'll like everyone. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Because after years of distance, I believed this invitation meant something. Perhaps my son wanted me back in his life. Perhaps the distance was ending. Perhaps we would become mother and son again. I had no idea that the people waiting at that birthday dinner would look at my hands and see only damage. And I had no idea that my own son would remain silent. When you spend most of your life expecting disappointment, hope can become a dangerous thing. For nearly 8 months, I had not seen Daniel. We spoke on the phone. We exchanged holiday cards. Sometimes he sent flowers on Mother's Day, but those things are not the same as sitting across from your child and hearing them laugh. So when he invited me to his birthday dinner in Connecticut, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps something had changed. Perhaps he missed me. Perhaps he finally wanted me to become part of his world. I marked the date on my calendar immediately. 3 weeks, 21 days. Every morning, I looked at that square on the calendar as if it contained a promise. The dinner would take place at an exclusive country club outside Greenwich. I had never been to Connecticut. I had certainly never been inside a country club, but none of that mattered. My son wanted me there. At least, that is what I told myself. The first problem was my closet. At 67, I owned exactly 3 dresses, one for church, one for funerals, one for special occasions. None of them seemed appropriate for what Daniel described as a nice dinner. One Saturday morning, I drove to a discount department store 30 minutes away. The saleswoman helping me could not have been older than 25. "Something special?" she asked. "My son's birthday." She smiled. "How old is he?" 41. "Oh, that's wonderful." I looked through racks of clothing that seemed designed for women much younger than me. Bright colors, tight fabrics, dresses that belonged in magazines rather than my life. Eventually, I found a simple navy blue dress. Elegant, modest, comfortable. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. The dress made me look softer somehow, less tired. I bought it immediately. The next problem was my hands. I had spent years learning how to hide them. Long sleeves, gloves, careful movements. Even after all these years, strangers still noticed. Children stared. Cashiers occasionally looked twice. Some scars had faded. Others remained. The skin across my fingers was uneven thick and permanently discolored. Several joints had become enlarged from decades of labor. I visited a small nail salon in town. The young woman doing my manicure held my hand gently. "You've worked very hard," she said quietly. I smiled. "Most of my life." She carefully trimmed my nails and applied clear polish. For a few moments, I imagined that perhaps my hands looked normal. Then I stepped outside into the sunlight. The scars were still there, the twisted joints, the rough skin. 40 years never disappear because of clear nail polish. That evening, I opened my dresser drawer and removed an old pair of cream-colored gloves. I had worn them to church years earlier. I slipped them on. The hands disappeared. The scars disappeared. The embarrassment disappeared. But so did the truth. I stared at myself in the mirror. A strange thought entered my mind. Why should I hide? These hands had fed my son, paid his tuition, kept our lights on, survived. Yet I still felt ashamed. I folded the gloves carefully and placed them back inside the drawer. The week before the trip, Daniel called. "You excited?" "Very. There'll be about 20 people." "Oh. Mostly friends from work." "That sounds nice." "And Olivia's parents will be there." I hesitated. "Her parents?" "They wanted to meet you." A strange nervousness settled inside me. What are they like? They're successful. Successful. The word again. I wondered if everyone in Daniel's world was successful. Lawyers, investors, business owners, people who discussed vacations in Europe, people who had never cleaned office buildings at midnight. Still, I told myself none of that mattered. I was his mother. 2 days before leaving, my neighbor Carol stopped by. She had lived beside me for almost 20 years. "You seem nervous." I am. She sat at my kitchen table. You raised him. I know. You built his whole life. I know. Then why are you afraid? I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. Because I don't belong in his world. She shook her head. No. You're afraid he thinks you don't belong. Her words stayed with me. Because they were true. The night before my trip, I barely slept. I ironed the dress twice, packed and unpacked my suitcase 3 times. I even practiced introducing myself to Olivia's parents. The next morning, I boarded a train. As the landscape changed outside the window, I watched small towns disappear and cities grow larger. Everything felt unfamiliar. The buildings, the traffic, the people. Connecticut looked exactly like the magazines and doctor's offices. Beautiful houses, perfect lawns, luxury cars, quiet streets. When Daniel met me at the station, my heart nearly burst. He looked handsome, older, more confident. There was gray beginning near his temples. For just a moment, I saw the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. Mom? He hugged me. Not quickly, not formally. A real hug. I closed my eyes. I've missed you. You too. The words sounded genuine, and for several hours I allowed myself to relax. He drove me through neighborhoods where the houses looked like estates. Large stone walls, iron gates, gardens, everything seemed expensive. Olivia grew up around here, he explained. It's beautiful. He nodded. At lunch, he told me about work. A major case. New clients, long hours. I listened carefully. I always had. Then he asked about Ohio, the garden, my health, the neighbors. The conversation felt natural, easy. For the first time in years, I felt like his mother again. That evening, I met Olivia. She was beautiful. Blonde hair, soft voice, elegant without appearing cold. She hugged me warmly. It's so nice to finally meet you. You too. She showed me around their apartment, offered tea, asked questions. For a while, my fears began to fade. Perhaps I had worried unnecessarily. Perhaps everything would be fine. The following afternoon, while Daniel was preparing for the dinner, I stood alone in the guest room, putting on my navy blue dress. I fastened a small necklace, styled my hair, applied lipstick. Then I looked down. My hands. The scars seemed darker against the elegant dress. The fingers appeared older, rougher. I opened my suitcase. Inside lay the cream-colored gloves. I picked them up, held them for several seconds, then slowly placed them back. No, I would not hide. Not tonight. Daniel knocked on the door. You ready? I smiled. I think so. He looked at me for a moment. You look nice, Mom. Those 4 words meant more than he realized. The drive to the country club took 20 minutes. As we approached the entrance, my stomach tightened. Large stone buildings, valet parking, perfect gardens, people dressed beautifully. I suddenly became aware of every detail about myself. My age, my accent, my clothes, my hands. Daniel parked the car. We're a little early. I nodded. He turned toward me. You'll be fine. I smiled. I'm not worried, but that was a lie. Because somewhere deep inside me, a small, frightened voice had already begun whispering. What if they see you the way you see yourself? What if your son does too? I stepped out of the car and looked up at the enormous building. The evening sun reflected against its windows. People laughed somewhere nearby. Music drifted from inside. And without realizing it, I rubbed my thumb against the scars on my fingers. 40 years of sacrifice rested in my hands. I had no idea that before the night ended, those same hands would become the center of an entire room's cruelty. The country club looked like something from a movie. Large stone walls rose above perfectly trimmed gardens. Crystal chandeliers glowed behind enormous windows. Men in dark suits laughed beside fireplaces, and women wearing diamonds held glasses of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. As Daniel and I walked through the front entrance, I suddenly became aware of every step I took. My shoes, my age, my accent, my hands. A young employee took our coats. Another escorted us toward a private dining room. Inside, nearly 20 people were already gathered. The room was beautiful. White tablecloths, silver candles, fresh flowers, soft music. Everything felt expensive. Everyone looked comfortable except me. Daniel placed his hand lightly against my back. "Mom, these are some friends from work." Several people smiled politely. A few shook my hand. I noticed how soft their hands felt. No scars, no calluses, no broken skin. Their fingers carried rings and watches. Mine carried 40 years. Olivia approached with a warm smile. "You look beautiful, Sierra." "Thank you." She introduced me to her parents. Her father, Richard Bennett, was kind and quiet. Her mother, Elaine, seemed reserved but polite. "So nice to finally meet you," Elaine said. "You too." For a few minutes, everything seemed fine. People discussed vacations, real estate, stock markets, court cases, business deals. I mostly listened. Occasionally, someone asked me where I lived. "What do you do?" "I worked in a textile factory for many years." Some nodded. Some looked surprised. One man said, "That's real work." I appreciated that. Dinner began. The waiter poured wine. Bread baskets appeared. Conversations became louder. Laughter filled the room. Daniel sat beside me. Across from us sat a man named Grant Whitmore. He was perhaps 50 years old, wealthy, confident, and the kind of person who seemed accustomed to being the center of attention. He worked in finance. At least that's what someone had mentioned earlier. Grant talked loudly, laughed loudly. Everything about him occupied space. At first, he seemed friendly. He told stories about business trips, expensive golf courses, private clubs. Everyone listened. Then somewhere between the salads and the main course it happened. I reached for my water glass. The candlelight fell directly across my hands. The scars, the twisted fingers, the rough skin. Grant stopped speaking. His eyes dropped to my hands. The table became strangely quiet. "What happened to your hands?" The question itself wasn't cruel. People had asked before. Children asked. Doctors asked. Cashiers sometimes asked. Usually I simply smiled. Years of work. But something about his tone made my stomach tighten. He leaned closer. "My God." Several people looked. I slowly placed my glass down. "They've seen a lot of years." He laughed softly. "I've never seen hands like that before." A woman beside him glanced at me. Madison Cole. Young, beautiful, perfect nails, perfect hair. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Oh my goodness," she said. "That must have been awful." I smiled politely. "It was a long time ago." Grant continued staring. "What kind of work causes that?" Before I could answer, another guest said, "Factory work, I think." Grant shook his head. "Incredible." The word didn't sound kind. It sounded fascinated, like someone studying damage. I suddenly became very aware that everyone at the table had stopped eating. Everyone was looking. I folded my hands together. Old habit. Hide them. Protect them. Daniel remained silent. That silence hurt more than the attention, because all he needed to do was speak. Just one sentence. She's my mother. She worked hard. Don't. Anything. Instead, he looked down at his plate. Madison laughed awkwardly. I'm sorry, but they honestly look painful. A few people smiled nervously. Someone changed the subject. Grant did not. Were you in an accident? I looked at him. No. So, what happened? I hesitated because I had spent years avoiding this question. Years protecting Daniel from these answers. Years pretending the scars did not matter. I worked for many years. Grant leaned back. Wow. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly enough for people to object. Just enough. You definitely earned retirement. Several people chuckled. My face grew warm. Olivia looked uncomfortable. Her mother lowered her eyes. Richard Bennett cleared his throat. Nobody said anything. Then Madison spoke again. I honestly don't know how you can live with hands like that. The room became quiet, painfully quiet. I looked at Daniel. He was still staring at his plate. I waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5. Nothing. The deepest wounds in life often happen during moments when we expect someone to stand beside us, and they don't. I suddenly remembered a little boy holding my hands in our kitchen. Mommy, your hands are strong? I remembered another little boy kissing burned fingers. I remembered a teenager promising that one day I would never work again. Where had he gone? Who was this man sitting beside me? Grant took another sip of wine. I mean, no offense. People always say that before offending you. Madison laughed again. They're kind of scary. That word, scary. My hands had held a feverish child, cooked meals, worked 3 jobs, written birthday cards, paid tuition bills, wiped tears, and now they were scary. I looked around the room. Nobody met my eyes, not even Daniel, especially not Daniel. The noise of the restaurant outside seemed far away. My chest felt tight. I realized I could no longer breathe comfortably. Quietly, I placed my napkin on the table. I think I should go. Daniel finally looked up. Mom. His voice came too late. Far too late. I stood carefully. At 67, dignity sometimes becomes the only thing you still control. Olivia rose slightly. Sierra. It's all right. But it wasn't. It wasn't all right. 40 years of sacrifice sat in those hands. 40 years of pain. 40 years of work. And my son had allowed strangers to reduce them to something ugly. I picked up my purse. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked once more at Daniel. His face carried embarrassment. Not anger, not protection. Embarrassment. As though he wished the evening would simply disappear. As though I would disappear with it. My heart broke quietly. Because mothers rarely stop loving. Even when they are wounded. Even when they are disappointed. Even when their children fail them. I turned toward the door. And then I heard a chair move. Not Daniel's. Not Olivia's. An older man sitting several seats away slowly rose to his feet. He had remained mostly silent throughout dinner. White hair, dark suit, sharp eyes, perhaps 78 years old. He looked directly at my hands, not with disgust, not with pity. Recognition. Something changed in his face. He stared at my scars for several long seconds. The entire room became silent again. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, steady. Those hands. He paused. I know those hands. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The old man looked around the room, and then he said words that would change everything. Every person sitting at this table should be ashamed. For several seconds after the older man spoke, nobody moved. The entire dining room seemed frozen. Grant still held his wine glass halfway to his lips. Madison stared at the table. Daniel looked confused, and I stood beside my chair with my purse in my hand, my heart still breaking inside my chest. The elderly man slowly straightened his jacket. He was tall despite his age, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that carried the kind of confidence only time can give a person. He looked directly at me. Not at my scars, not at my damaged fingers. At me. Sierra. My breath caught. Very few people from my past still remained. Very few people would recognize me after nearly 40 years. I looked carefully at his face. The lines, the eyes, the voice. Something stirred inside my memory. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "Do I know you?" He smiled gently. "Charles Whitaker." The name hit me like a wave. Charles Whitaker, owner of Whitaker Textile Manufacturing. The factory. The old brick building outside Dayton. The place where I had spent most of my youth. The place that had changed my life forever. I stared at him. He was much older now. The dark hair had disappeared. The strong shoulders had bent slightly. But suddenly I could see the man who once walked through factory floors speaking to workers by name. "Oh my God," I whispered. He nodded. "It's been a long time." No one else at the table understood. Grant looked confused. "You know each other?" Charles slowly turned toward him. "Yes." His voice became colder. "I know exactly whose hands these are." The room became silent again. Daniel finally spoke. "Mr. Whitaker." Charles looked at him. "You're Daniel?" "Yeah." He nodded slowly. "I've wanted to meet you for many years." I saw confusion cross my son's face. "What do you mean?" Charles looked back at my hands. Then he looked around the room. "I've spent nearly 50 years around workers." Nobody interrupted him. "I've seen injuries, accidents, broken bones, burns. And I can tell you something." He pointed gently toward me. "Those hands are not signs of weakness." He paused. "They're signs of courage." Grant shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean any offense." Charles ignored him. He slowly walked toward me. At 78 years old, his movements were careful but steady. When he reached me, he gently took my damaged hands in his own. The entire room watched. I would recognize these hands anywhere. I could feel my eyes beginning to fill with tears, because very few people had ever truly seen them. Not the scars, not the story, the meaning. Charles looked at Daniel. "Your mother saved lives." Daniel frowned. "What?" I immediately felt panic. "No." Charles turned toward me. "Sierra." I shook my head slightly. "Please, not here, not now." But Charles continued. "These people deserve to know who they're judging." Grant looked embarrassed. Madison lowered her eyes. Even Olivia appeared stunned. Daniel spoke again. "What is he talking about?" Charles exhaled slowly. 40 years ago, there was a fire. My stomach tightened. The room disappeared. The music disappeared. The expensive walls disappeared. Because suddenly, I could smell smoke again, feel heat, hear screaming. "No," I whispered. But Charles gently squeezed my fingers. "You've hidden long enough." He turned toward the others. "Most of you only see scars." He pointed carefully toward my hands. "I see the woman who ran back into a burning building." Nobody moved. Daniel stared at him. "What?" Charles continued. "Our factory caught fire." He looked at me. "Most people escaped." I closed my eyes because I remembered. God, I remembered. Smoke, panic, sirens, fear. Charles continued speaking. "2 young women were trapped inside." Grant looked stunned. Madison covered her mouth. "Your mother went back." Daniel shook his head. "No." "Yes." I felt tears running down my cheeks, because I had spent decades keeping this part of my life buried. Not because I was ashamed, because survival sometimes requires silence. Charles looked directly at Daniel. "She saved them." The room remained perfectly still. "She suffered severe burns." My fingers trembled. Daniel stared at my hands, really stared at them, perhaps for the first time in his life. The scars, the twisted joints, the damaged skin. Suddenly, they were no longer strange. They had become evidence. Charles continued. "The doctors weren't sure she'd ever use her hands properly again." My breathing became uneven, because these were words I had not heard aloud in decades, words I had locked away. Grant spoke quietly. "I didn't know." Charles looked at him. "No, you didn't." His voice became harder. "But you laughed anyway." Nobody could answer. The silence now belonged to shame. Not mine, theirs. Daniel slowly rose from his chair. He looked pale. "Mom." I could not look at him, because I suddenly remembered every moment I had hidden, every lie, every "I'm fine," every "don't worry," every bandage I had covered, every scar I had explained away. Charles spoke softly. After the fire, she returned to work. Daniel looked confused. "How?" Charles gave a sad smile. "Because she had a little boy." The room felt smaller, warmer, heavier. "She refused compensation." I looked up immediately. "Charles." "It's true." He turned toward Daniel. "The company offered assistance." I had forgotten that, or perhaps I had chosen to forget. "What did she ask for?" Daniel whispered. Charles looked directly at him. "Nothing for herself." My eyes closed, because I knew exactly what he would say next. "She said, just make sure my son has opportunities someday." Daniel's face changed. Something inside him broke. I could see it. His eyes filled with tears. His breathing became uneven. The confident attorney, the successful professional, the polished man from Manhattan, all of him seemed to disappear. For a brief moment, I saw my little boy again. The child who used to hold my fingers. The child who once promised to take care of me. Olivia quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Her father lowered his head. Even Grant seemed unable to speak. Charles looked around the room one final time. "You looked at these hands and saw something ugly." He gently raised my fingers. "I see sacrifice." Another pause. "I see courage." Another. "I see a mother." Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Daniel finally walked toward me, very slowly, as though approaching someone he no longer understood. "Mom." His voice cracked. I could not answer, because I was still standing inside two worlds, the elegant dining room and the burning factory. And somewhere between those two places stood my son, looking at his mother's hands for the very first time. For a long time, nobody spoke. The dining room remained silent except for the soft sound of a fireplace burning somewhere behind us. Daniel was still standing. His eyes remained fixed on my hands, not with embarrassment, not with discomfort, with confusion, as if he were looking at a stranger, as if he were realizing that the woman who raised him had lived an entire life he had never known. "Mom," he whispered again. I looked away because I suddenly felt exposed. For 40 years, I had buried those memories, not because I was ashamed, because surviving sometimes requires forgetting. Charles slowly returned to his seat, but before sitting down, he looked at me. "You don't have to tell them." His voice was gentle. "But perhaps it's time." I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was 31 years old again. The factory whistle, the smell of cotton, the endless noise of machinery. The younger version of myself still lived somewhere inside those memories. She was exhausted, scared, determined, and she still had most of her hands. "It happened in March," I said quietly. Nobody interrupted. The weather was cold. Daniel slowly sat down. The entire table listened. Daniel was 6 years old. I looked at him. "You were home with Mrs. Collins from next door." He said nothing, because he had no memory of that day. Children rarely remember the moments that change their parents forever. The fire had started during the evening shift. The old factory building had always worried people. The wiring was old. The machinery was old. The walls themselves seemed tired. But people still needed jobs, and mothers still needed paychecks. I had stayed late that night. Extra hours, extra money, always extra money. "There was a smell," I said, "burning." I could almost smell it again. Oil, smoke, heat. One of the machines had malfunctioned. Nobody knew exactly how. Someone shouted. Then another person screamed. Within seconds, smoke began filling the building. People ran. Alarms sounded. Machines shut down. Everything became confusion. We were trying to get outside. My voice had become softer. The room seemed to disappear again. I remember people crying. I remember somebody falling. Charles lowered his eyes, because he remembered too. The factory had employed nearly 200 people then, many of them women, many of them mothers. The exits became crowded. People pushed. Some screamed. Some prayed. "I made it outside." Grant looked surprised. "Then why did you go back?" I looked at him, because even after all these years, I had asked myself that same question. "I heard them." The room remained silent. "Two girls. They were young, barely 20. One had only started working there a few months earlier. The other was helping her. Smoke had blocked part of the building. People were shouting that someone was trapped. Firefighters had not yet arrived. Everybody was afraid, including me, especially me, because I had a 6-year-old son waiting at home, because I was a single mother, because I had every reason to stay outside. I don't know why I went back. Charles spoke quietly. Yes, you do. I looked at him. He nodded. Because that's who you are. Tears filled my eyes. Because sometimes other people understand us better than we understand ourselves. The smoke inside the factory had been terrible. Black, thick, hot. The emergency lights barely worked. I remember wrapping part of my shirt around my mouth. I remember hearing coughing, crying, someone calling for help. I found one of them first. The young woman had fallen. She could barely breathe. I helped her toward an exit. The heat had become unbearable. Parts of the ceiling were already burning. I should have left. I know that now. But then I heard the second girl. She was trapped. A metal shelf had collapsed. She couldn't move. Daniel stared at me, completely still, because this was not the mother he knew. This was someone else, someone younger, someone brave, someone he had never met. I tried lifting the shelf. My fingers unconsciously touched the scars. It was too heavy. The heat had become intense. Smoke filled the room. My lungs burned. But the girl kept crying. Please, please don't leave me. There are moments when life becomes very simple. Not easy. Simple. You either walk away or you stay. I stayed. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. I don't remember everything. That was true. Trauma steals pieces of memory. Some moments remain. Others disappear forever. I remembered falling. I remembered pain. I remembered fire. Mostly I remembered my hands. The shelf had shifted. The metal had become dangerously hot. Burning debris had fallen. Everything happened very quickly, very slowly, both at the same time. By the time firefighters reached us, my hands had suffered severe burns. I spent several days in the hospital. The doctors were uncertain. Charles finally spoke. The specialists believed you might lose movement. I nodded. They did. Daniel looked horrified. You never told me. I gave a small smile. You were 6. But later, I looked down. Later, you were busy growing up. The truth hurt. Not because Daniel had failed me, because I had hidden everything. I remembered sitting in a hospital bed, bandages covering both hands, pain so intense that sleeping became impossible. The doctor sat beside me. You need time. I can't. You may not be able to return to factory work. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, because I had no other choice. I have a son. That sentence explained every decision I made afterward. Physical therapy, pain, exercises, months of recovery, and eventually work. Because Daniel needed shoes, school supplies, food, hope. The company offered assistance. Charles himself had visited me. He was much younger then. You deserve compensation. I need a job. You need recovery. I need to feed my son. I remembered that conversation perfectly, because I had only asked one question. Will I still be able to work? Charles nodded slowly. You refused nearly everything. I looked at Daniel. I couldn't afford pride. The room was silent again. Madison was crying. Olivia wiped her eyes. Even Grant seemed unable to look at me. Daniel spoke quietly. The scars. never fully healed. The pain. Some days are worse. He looked at my fingers. When I was little, why didn't you tell me? I smiled sadly. Because children shouldn't carry their parents' pain. Charles looked at him. Your mother came back to work before she was ready. I nodded. I had bills. And a little boy. The memories continued coming now. Bandages hidden beneath gloves. Pain medication. Long nights. Hands that no longer moved properly. Hands that still had to work. I looked at Daniel. For the first time that evening, I truly saw him. Not the lawyer, not the successful man. My son. And his eyes had filled with tears. I never knew. His voice broke. I know. Why didn't you tell me? Because mothers often believe love means protection. Because suffering seems easier when children don't see it. Because I wanted him to grow up looking toward his future instead of my pain. I reached for my glass. My damaged fingers trembled slightly. Daniel immediately noticed. Perhaps he always had. Perhaps he simply never understood. I used to hate these hands, I said softly. Everyone looked at me. After the fire, I swallowed. They frightened me. I looked down at them. The scars, the rough skin, the twisted joints. But then I realized something. Daniel listened. These hands allowed me to come home to my son. Tears ran down his face, because suddenly he understood. Every scar, every ache, every damaged finger. They were not signs of weakness. They were the price of survival. And for the first time in his life, my son was beginning to understand exactly what those hands had built. No one at the table touched their food. The candles continued burning. The waiters moved quietly around the edges of the room, pretending not to hear what had just happened. But everything had changed. Only 30 minutes earlier, my hands had been something to laugh at. Now they had become something nobody knew how to look at. Daniel remained seated beside me, staring down at his own hands. I had seen my son lose arguments. I had seen him frustrated. I had seen him tired. But I had never seen him broken. Charles finally sat back down. His voice became softer. There is something else you should know. I immediately shook my head. Charles, please. He looked at me gently. For years, you've protected everyone except yourself. I lowered my eyes, because perhaps he was right. Daniel turned toward him. What else? Charles folded his hands together. After the fire, the company created a compensation package. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means your mother could have received money. Grant looked surprised. Then why didn't she? I almost laughed. Because to people with money, money solves everything. To a single mother raising a child alone, the question is never money. The question is time. The question is survival. Charles looked directly at Daniel. Your mother spent 6 weeks in recovery. Daniel's eyes widened. 6 weeks? I nodded quietly. He looked stunned. I thought you only hurt your hands. The burns were severe. His face had become pale. You never told me. I smiled sadly. You were 6. But later, I looked away. Later life became busy. Charles spoke again. The insurance company recommended disability benefits. Daniel turned toward him. And your mother refused. The room became silent again. Why? Daniel whispered. I finally answered. Because disability payments wouldn't pay your college tuition someday. His eyes filled. Mom, Charles continued. She told me something I'll never forget. I knew exactly what he was going to say, because those words had followed me for nearly 4 decades. If I stop working, she said, my son loses opportunities. Daniel's breathing became uneven. I could see him remembering his childhood, the lunches, the school supplies, the baseball uniforms, the college applications, the books, the rent, the electricity, everything. And perhaps for the first time, he was asking himself where all those things had come from. He looked at my hands again. Those hands. The hands he had hidden from his friends only an hour earlier. Charles leaned back. I offered her office work. I remembered that meeting. The old office. The smell of paper. My bandaged fingers. She said no. Daniel looked confused. Why? Charles smiled sadly. Because the office position paid less. The truth sounded absurd, even to me, but poverty teaches mathematics that wealthy people never learn. $5 matters. $10 matters. Every hour matters. Every dollar becomes part of a child's future. I remembered telling Charles I can still work. He had looked at my bandages. Your hands need time. My son doesn't have time. Daniel spoke quietly. I don't understand. I looked at him. You wanted to go to summer camp. He frowned. What? When you were 8. His eyes searched his memory. You wanted to go. I remember. The camp cost $400. He looked at me. I told you Grandma helped. I swallowed. She didn't. His voice became very soft. You worked? I nodded. Double shifts? The room remained completely silent. I continued. You needed braces. His eyes widened. The insurance didn't cover them. He said nothing. You wanted a computer in high school. His breathing changed. You said you got a bonus. I smiled. I didn't. Every memory felt like opening an old wound, but perhaps wounds need air. Perhaps truth requires pain. Daniel's voice trembled. How many things? I looked down. I honestly didn't know. Too many. The years had blurred together. Extra shifts, overtime, night jobs, pain medication, bandages, bills. Children never see these things. That is often the point. Grant finally spoke. His voice had lost all confidence. I'm sorry. I looked at him. For the first time that evening, he looked small, truly small. I didn't know. I nodded. I know. Madison wiped tears from her face. I feel terrible. Nobody answered, because guilt belongs to the people who carry it. Daniel suddenly stood. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone looked up. He walked several steps away from the table, toward the large windows overlooking the golf course. His shoulders trembled. Olivia quietly followed him. I could see them speaking. Daniel covered his face, and suddenly I remembered another moment. He was 17. The night before leaving for college, we sat on our porch. The summer air was warm. He had held my hands. "I'll take care of you someday." At the time, I had smiled, because mothers do not expect repayment. Love is not a transaction. Sacrifice is not a debt. But standing in that room watching my grown son break apart, I realized something. He had not forgotten his promise. He had forgotten the cost. After several minutes, Daniel returned. His eyes were red. His voice was barely audible. "Mom." I looked at him. He sat beside me again. Not the successful attorney, not the polished professional. Only my son. He reached slowly toward my hands, perhaps the first truly voluntary touch in years. His fingers gently touched the scars, the twisted joints, the rough skin. His voice cracked. "Did they always hurt?" I nodded. "Some days." He swallowed. "And I never knew." "No." "Why?" I looked at him, because the answer was simple. Because mothers often carry pain privately. Because children deserve childhood. Because I loved him. "You had enough to worry about." He began crying. Real tears. Not embarrassment, not guilt. Grief. The grief of realizing that someone loved you more than you ever understood. Charles spoke softly. "Your mother asked me for one favor." Daniel looked up. "What favor?" Charles smiled gently. "She said, if my son ever needs help finding work one day, remember his name." Daniel stared. "I didn't know you." "No." "Then why?" I answered, "Because I wanted doors to open for you." Charles nodded. "When your law firm hired you years later, I recognized your name." Daniel froze. "What?" "I made one phone call." The room became silent once again. Daniel looked shocked. "You never told me." Charles smiled. "Your mother asked me not to." Daniel turned toward me. Tears continued falling. "Why would you do that?" I took a long breath. Because this answer contained 40 years. Because this answer explained every scar, every shift, every sacrifice. Because you were my son. Nothing else needed to be said. Daniel lowered his head. His shoulders shook. The room remained quiet. And for the first time in many years, my son was not seeing the successful attorney he had become. He was seeing the woman who had carried him there. And he was beginning to understand that every achievement he possessed had been built by the very hands he had been ashamed to defend. The drive back to New York the next morning was quiet, very quiet. Daniel offered to take me to the train station, but neither of us seemed to know what to say. The previous evening had changed something between us. Not broken, not healed, changed. Olivia sat in the back seat for part of the drive. She had been unusually quiet since the dinner. The confident young woman I had met only days earlier now seemed thoughtful, almost sad. As we approached the station, Daniel finally spoke. "Mom." I looked out the window. "Yes, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, simple, small, insufficient, but real. I nodded. "I know." He gripped the steering wheel. "No, you don't understand." I turned toward him. I should have said something. Neither of us mentioned the dinner directly. Neither of us said Grant's name, or Madison's, or embarrassment, because the real wound sat between us. Silence, his silence, I saw them looking at your hands, he said quietly. I waited, and I froze. I nodded. I know. His voice cracked. I hate myself for that. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I reached over and touched his arm. The same boy. Still the same boy. Just older. Just lost. You don't need to hate yourself. He looked at me. But I do. The train arrived shortly afterward. He carried my suitcase. We stood beside the platform. The cold morning air reminded me of Ohio. He suddenly hugged me, very tightly, longer than usual. I love you. I closed my eyes. I love you too. And then I left. The ride home felt longer than usual. My body hurt. My hands ached. But the deepest pain sat somewhere inside my chest. Because I had finally realized something. My son had not been ashamed of my scars. He had been ashamed of not understanding them. Those are different things. Still understanding does not immediately heal wounds. When I arrived home, my small house felt quieter than ever. I unpacked my suitcase, hung the blue dress in the closet, placed my necklace back inside its box. And then I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had done homework, the same table where we had eaten cheap dinners, the same table where bills had once covered every inch of wood. My hands rested before me. For years I had hidden them, protected people from them, protected myself from them. Perhaps I had also protected Daniel from the truth. 3 days passed, then 4. Daniel called several times. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I didn't yet know what to say. On the 5th day, he appeared at my front door. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. He looked exhausted. His tie was gone. His eyes were red. When did you get here? An hour ago. Why didn't you call? I did? I smiled slightly. That's fair. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, like a teenager, like a boy asking permission. Can I come in? Of course. The house had not changed much over the years. Same furniture, same curtains, same photographs. Daniel slowly walked through each room, his childhood bedroom, the old bookshelf, the kitchen. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. Most childhood places do. I forgot this wallpaper. I laughed. I couldn't afford to replace it. He turned toward me, and there it was again. That expression, the one that had appeared at the dinner, the expression of a man realizing how little he knew. We sat quietly, coffee between us, neither speaking. Finally, he asked, "Did you really sleep in your car?" I froze. Charles had not mentioned that. Who told you? He looked down. Mrs. Collins, our old neighbor. Apparently, she had spoken with him after the dinner. I sighed. Sometimes. His eyes filled again. How often? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I looked at him carefully, because this wasn't guilt anymore. This was grief, and grief asks questions. I didn't have enough gas sometimes. His voice became very soft. And you never told me. I smiled sadly. You were a child. He shook his head. I was also your son. That sentence stayed with me, because perhaps both things had always been true. That afternoon, Daniel wandered into the hallway closet. It was an old closet, mostly forgotten. Boxes, Christmas decorations, old coats, things we never throw away. I heard him moving things, opening boxes. Several minutes later, his voice came from the hallway. "Mom." Something in his tone frightened me. I walked toward him. The box sat open on the floor. I had not touched it in years. Inside were papers, hospital bills, old receipts, medical records, collection notices, insurance letters. The past. Daniel picked up one of the envelopes. His hands trembled. "What's this?" I immediately knew. The hospital bill after the fire. He looked at the amount. His eyes widened. "You owed this?" I nodded. Another paper. Physical therapy. Another. Prescription costs. Another. Past due notices. His breathing changed. Then he found the letters. The letters I had written during difficult years. Letters I had never mailed. Letters written late at night. Letters meant for him. I had forgotten they existed. He carefully opened one. I immediately said, "You don't have to read those." He looked at me. "I want to." The paper had yellowed with age. He began reading silently. After several moments, tears appeared. "What is it?" He couldn't answer. Finally, he handed it to me. The date at the top read October 14th. Daniel, age 11. I remembered writing it. The letter said, "Dear Daniel, today I worked 16 hours. My hands hurt so badly that I cried in the parking lot before driving home. But you received an A in science, and you smiled all through dinner. That smile is worth every ache. If one day you become successful, I hope you never measure people by their clothes, their jobs, or their hands. I hope you remember kindness. Love, Mom." Daniel covered his face. There were more letters. Dozens. Some written after difficult days. Some after birthdays. Some after Christmases. Things I had never said aloud. Things mothers often keep hidden. One letter read, "I am afraid you will someday become too successful to understand where you came from." Another, "I hope you never feel embarrassed by me." And another, "If I ever become a burden, please remember that I once carried you." Daniel was crying openly now. Real tears. Childlike tears. The tears of a son meeting his mother for the first time. I never knew. I sat beside him. I know. He held one of the letters tightly. "Why didn't you give these to me?" I looked around the old closet, the old boxes, the old bills, the old pain, because sometimes parents write things they hope their children never need to read. "I wanted you to have a happy life." He shook his head. "I wanted you in that life." For several minutes we sat there together on the floor. Not lawyer, not successful professional, not aging mother, simply a son, simply his mother. And surrounded by forgotten papers and old pain, Daniel Patterson finally began understanding the true cost of the life he had built. But the hardest conversation between us still had not happened. Because apologies are easier than truth. And forgiveness takes longer than either of them. For 2 days after Daniel found the box in my closet, neither of us talked about forgiveness. We talked about weather, about the garden, about the neighbor's dog, about the broken fence in my backyard. Anything except the one thing sitting between us. Pain. Real pain. Not the scars, not the fire, not even the years of struggle. The pain of feeling invisible to your own child. Daniel stayed in Ohio longer than he had planned. He canceled meetings, ignored phone calls, worked remotely from my kitchen table, the same kitchen where he had once done multiplication homework. Sometimes I watched him while I washed dishes. The expensive attorney from Manhattan looked strangely out of place sitting beneath my old clock and faded curtains. Yet part of me enjoyed having him there. Another part remained cautious. Because love returns quickly, trust does not. One evening after dinner, he carried 2 cups of tea into the living room. The television remained off. Rain tapped softly against the windows. He sat across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Can we talk?" I already knew this moment would come. Yes. His hands trembled slightly. The same hands that had once fit entirely inside mine. "I don't know how to fix this." I looked down at my tea. "Neither do I." The honesty surprised both of us. Because mothers often rush to comfort, to forgive, to erase pain. But something inside me refused to pretend. He swallowed. "I've said I'm sorry." "Yes. And I mean it." "I know." His eyes filled again. "Then why does it still feel so terrible?" "Because apologies are sometimes the beginning, not the ending." I looked at him, really looked at him, 41 years old, successful, intelligent, and suddenly very young. "Because you hurt me." His face fell. "I know." "No, Daniel?" My voice remained calm. "You know you embarrassed me." He stared. "But you don't understand how deeply you hurt me." The room became very quiet. Rain continued outside. I folded my hands together. The same hands. Always the same hands. "I spent most of my life protecting you." He lowered his eyes. "I know." "I protected you from hunger." "I know." "I protected you from fear." His voice shook. "I know." "I protected you from the truth." He looked at me. "And when people laughed at me." I paused. The words hurt. You said nothing." Tears immediately filled his eyes. I froze. "I know. I hate myself for it." I shook my head. "This isn't about punishment." He looked confused. "Then what is it about?" I took a slow breath. Because after all these years, I finally needed him to hear the truth. "You didn't embarrass me." His face tightened. "You broke my heart." The words remained between us, heavy, final, real. He began crying immediately, not quietly, not politely, the kind of crying that comes when something inside finally breaks open. "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I know." "No, Mom, please." "Daniel." He looked up. "I spent 40 years believing that if I worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, if I protected you enough one day, you would look at me and feel proud." His shoulders shook. "And when they laughed," my own voice trembled now, "I looked at you." Tears blurred my vision. "And you looked away." He covered his face. Because there was nothing to argue, nothing to defend, only truth. Several minutes passed. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I was ashamed." The words surprised me. He quickly continued, "Not of you." I waited. "Of myself." I looked at him carefully. "I didn't know your story." "You never asked." He nodded. "I know." His breathing steadied slightly. I built this version of you in my head. What version? He struggled to answer. The strong mom. I almost laughed. I was strong. I know. The woman who could handle everything. I nodded. You handled everything. His voice cracked again. So I forgot that you paid a price. The sentence struck me, because perhaps that was true. Children often mistake strength for invincibility. He continued. I thought your hands were just... He stopped. Old. I smiled sadly. They are old. No. His eyes moved toward my fingers. They're a story. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then he asked something that frightened me. Do you regret it? I looked at him. The fire? No. The jobs? No. The sacrifices? The room became quiet, because this question deserved honesty. I looked toward the family photographs sitting beside the fireplace. Daniel at graduation. Daniel in Little League. Daniel holding his law degree. Daniel smiling. My son. My body regrets it. He looked confused. My hands regret it. I flexed my fingers slowly. The pain regrets it. I looked back at him, but my heart doesn't. He cried harder, because mothers make impossible statements that children spend their lives trying to understand. He moved from his chair, sat beside me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he gently took my hands. Not because he felt guilty, because he wanted to. His fingers touched the scars, the rough skin, the damaged joints. I never really looked at them. I nodded. I know. He shook his head. No. His tears fell onto our hands. I mean, I never saw them. The distinction mattered, seeing and looking. He had looked before, but now he was seeing. He lifted one finger carefully. Does this hurt? Sometimes. This one, cold weather. His voice broke again. How many years? I smiled. Most of them. He lowered his head. I wish I could go back. So do I. I would stand up. I reached toward his face. My damaged fingers touched his cheek. The same cheek I had kissed as a child. The same boy. Always the same boy. I believe you. He closed his eyes. Can you forgive me? The question finally arrived. Not at the country club. Not after the apology. Not after the letters. Now. I thought carefully, because forgiveness given too quickly can become dishonesty. And I had spent enough years hiding truth. I don't know. He nodded. The answer hurt him. I could see it, but he accepted it. Because love is not always immediate. Healing is not immediate. He whispered, I'll wait. And somehow those two words mattered more than all the apologies. Because for the first time in many years, my son was not trying to solve my pain. He was willing to sit beside it. Outside, the rain had stopped. The house felt quiet again. But the silence between us had changed. It was no longer distance. It was grief. And grief, unlike distance, can eventually heal. As he continued holding my hands, I realized something. The boy who once promised to take care of me had finally returned. Not because he had become successful, not because he had money, because he had finally learned to see. Healing does not happen all at once. Movies teach us that one apology changes everything. One hug, one speech, one tearful moment. Real life is slower. Real life asks people to show up again and again until trust slowly returns. Daniel stayed in Ohio for another week. His office called constantly. Clients needed him. Meetings waited. Deadlines approached. For the first time in his adult life, he chose not to leave. Each morning, he sat at my kitchen table answering emails while I made coffee. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. But silence no longer frightened me. One Tuesday morning, I woke up to find him standing in the kitchen. He was reading the instructions on my old coffee maker. "I think your machine hates me." I laughed. "No, it just knows you're from New York." He smiled. The smile looked younger, closer to the boy I remembered. That afternoon, he surprised me. "Get your coat." I looked up. "Why?" "We have an appointment." "What appointment?" He hesitated. "A hand specialist?" I immediately shook my head. "No." "Mom." "No." The answer came too quickly, too sharply, because I had spent 40 years accepting pain. Pain had become normal. The aching joints, the stiffness, the numbness during winter, the nights when my fingers throbbed, all of it belonged to me. "It won't change anything." He sat beside me. "Maybe it will. I've lived with this my whole life." And I ignored it my whole life. I looked away because guilt had returned to his voice. I didn't want guilt. I wanted understanding. He reached for my hand, not carefully anymore, naturally. "I can't change the past." "No, but maybe I can help now." The specialist was an hour away. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and coffee. I felt embarrassed sitting there. At 67 years old, I felt too old to ask for help. The doctor examined my hands carefully. He studied the scars, the joints, the old burn injuries. He asked questions. How long? How often? What kind of pain? Daniel listened to every answer. The doctor finally leaned back. "Some damage can't be reversed." I smiled. "I know, but some things can improve." Daniel immediately asked questions: therapy, medication, exercises, special braces, options, hope. I watched him, the same boy who once asked 1,000 questions, the same boy who used to worry when I caught a cold. Somewhere along the way, I had lost him. Or perhaps he had simply lost himself. As we walked to the parking lot, he opened my car door. Something he had never done before. I laughed. "Are you becoming a gentleman?" He smiled. "I'm trying to become a son." The words stayed with me. Weeks passed. Daniel returned to New York, but things had changed. He called every evening. Not because he felt guilty, because he wanted to. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. He asked about my hands, the weather, the garden, my doctor appointments, my neighbors, ordinary things, beautiful things. One Saturday, he drove to Ohio unexpectedly. When I opened the door, he held grocery bags. "What is all this dinner? You cook?" I watched videos. The kitchen became a disaster. Sauce burned. Pasta overcooked. Smoke filled the room. I laughed harder than I had in years. He looked horrified. "This is terrible. It's awful." We ate it anyway. For the first time in years, my house felt alive. Several weeks later, Olivia visited. I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me still remembered the country club, the silence, the embarrassment. She sat beside me on my porch while Daniel worked inside. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. You didn't laugh. No, she swallowed. But I didn't say anything. The words surprised me, because silence hurts many people, not just one. She continued. I grew up around people who judge appearances. She looked down. I never realized how much. The autumn wind moved through the trees. Leaves fell across the yard. My grandmother worked in a factory, she said quietly. I turned toward her. Really? She nodded. I was always embarrassed by her hands. Neither of us spoke, because suddenly we understood each other. Until she died. Her eyes filled. And then I realized I had spent years looking at her instead of seeing her. I reached for her hand. Pain teaches recognition. She smiled. I think Daniel is changing. I looked toward the house. He stood at my sink washing dishes. The sight felt impossible. He is. She hesitated. There are some people he doesn't see anymore. I knew exactly who she meant. Grant, Madison, several others. Why? She smiled sadly. He says they only know how to measure success. I looked down at my hands. Perhaps my son was finally learning how to measure something else. One evening, during another phone call, he asked, Do you remember when I wanted a blue house? I laughed. You were 10. You remembered. Of course. He became quiet. I found a house. I frowned. What? A small one. Daniel. Not for now. I waited. For later. My eyes filled with tears, because suddenly I remembered that little boy sitting beside me all those years ago. I'll buy you a blue house. Children make promises. Adults forget them. Sometimes they remember. The biggest surprise came in November. Daniel called. I've been invited to speak at a legal conference. That's wonderful. He hesitated. They want me to talk about success. I smiled. You've certainly had some. No. His voice became very quiet. I think I finally understand where my success came from. I felt my heart tighten. He continued, I want you to come. The words frightened me. Why? Because people need to meet you. I immediately shook my head, though he couldn't see me. No. Mom. No speeches. No stage. No. He laughed softly. You haven't even heard the idea. I looked out the kitchen window. The garden had begun preparing for winter. The trees stood bare. Everything seemed quieter now, calmer. What idea? His voice softened. I spent years introducing you as my mother. I said nothing. I think it's time I introduced you properly. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time. The little boy who once believed my hands could fix everything had grown into a man. A flawed man, a hurting man, but perhaps also a better man. And for the first time in many years, I realized something. Maybe forgiveness wasn't one moment. Maybe it was watching your child become who you always hoped they would be. Slowly, painfully, one choice at a time. As winter approached, Daniel Patterson was learning how to be a son again. And I, Sierra Patterson, was beginning to believe that broken things could still heal. The legal conference took place in Chicago in early spring. Daniel called me 3 times during the week before the event. Each conversation ended exactly the same way. You don't have to speak. I know. You can simply sit in the audience. I know. And if you feel uncomfortable, we leave. I smiled every time, because my son had become protective, not out of guilt anymore, out of love. Still, I nearly canceled. Large hotels frightened me. Ballrooms frightened me. Rooms full of successful people frightened me. The country club had left scars that even my damaged hands could not match. When Daniel arrived to pick me up at the airport, he immediately noticed my nervousness. You can still say no. I looked at him. No. He smiled. Good. The conference hotel stood in the center of downtown Chicago. Glass walls, marble floors, hundreds of people wearing suits, lawyers, judges, business leaders. Everything about the place reminded me of the country club, except this time, Daniel never walked ahead of me. He walked beside me. That small difference mattered more than he understood. The conference lasted 2 days. Daniel was one of the featured speakers. His topic was supposed to be simple: leadership, success, professional growth. The organizers had even printed brochures. I saw his photograph beside several impressive accomplishments. Partner, attorney, award recipient, rising leader. As I sat alone in my hotel room the night before his speech, I looked at those words. Successful, respected, accomplished. The same words that had once created distance between us. I touched my fingers. The scars felt particularly stiff. Rain had moved into the city. Cold weather always made the pain worse. A knock sounded at the door. Daniel entered carrying 2 cups of tea, just as he had done months earlier in my living room. Some things had begun becoming habits again. You okay? I nodded. He sat beside me. I changed my speech. I looked at him. What do you mean? He smiled nervously. I don't want to talk about leadership. What do you want to talk about? He looked directly at me. Success. That's what they asked for. He shook his head. No. His eyes filled slightly. They asked the wrong person. I frowned. What does that mean? He took a long breath. Tomorrow, I want people to know the truth. I suddenly understood. No. Mom. No. He smiled softly. You said no very quickly. I stood and walked toward the window. The city lights reflected against the glass. I don't want attention. You deserve recognition. I don't. He approached slowly. You spent your whole life making sure people saw me. I closed my eyes. And now I want them to see you. The next morning, I almost stayed in my room. The ballroom held nearly 400 people. Rows of chairs, large screens, bright lights. Everything seemed overwhelming. Daniel sat beside me before the event began. His hand rested gently over mine. The same hands. Always the hands. I love you. I looked at him. I love you too. The first speakers discussed business, technology, leadership strategies, market trends. People applauded. People took notes. Everything felt professional. Safe. Then Daniel's name appeared on the screen. He walked onto the stage, confident, calm, successful. The audience applauded. I felt proud, very proud. He adjusted the microphone, smiled, and then surprised everyone. Good morning. People settled into their seats. I was invited here to speak about success. He paused. For most of my life, I thought success belonged to people like me. The room became quiet. He looked toward me. I immediately knew. My heart began racing. I graduated from law school. He smiled. I became a partner. People call me successful. Another pause. But 6 months ago, I realized I had no idea what success actually looked like. The audience listened carefully. Daniel reached into his pocket. He removed an old photograph. One I recognized immediately. Me. 30 years old. Standing outside the factory, holding 6-year-old Daniel. He looked at the audience. This is my mother. The screen behind him changed. The photograph appeared. I gasped. I had not seen that picture in years. My mother raised me alone. His voice remained steady. She worked multiple jobs. She survived a factory fire. She suffered permanent injuries. The room became silent. I became a lawyer because she sacrificed everything. He swallowed. And then one day, I sat silently while people mocked her hands. My heart stopped. The honesty shocked me. He looked down briefly. I failed her. No one moved. No one spoke. I spent years introducing her as my mother. His voice broke. But I never introduced her properly. He looked directly at me. Tears filled his eyes. Her name is Sierra Patterson. The room remained completely silent. She saved 2 women during a factory fire. Several people shifted. Others listened carefully. She returned to work with injured hands because she wanted her son to have opportunities. His breathing became uneven. And when people laughed at those hands, I forgot what they had built. I could no longer stop crying. The audience remained perfectly quiet. Not pity. Respect. Daniel stepped away from the podium. He looked toward me. Mom! Every person turned. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I stood. Slowly. Carefully. He extended his hand. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Then I walked toward the stage. The room blurred. The lights, the faces, the applause that slowly began. When I reached him, he gently took my hands. The entire audience could see them. The scars, the rough skin, the twisted fingers. For 40 years, I had hidden them. Now they stood beneath bright lights. Daniel raised them carefully. These hands built my life. The applause grew louder. People stood, one by one. Rows of strangers. Hundreds of people. Standing, clapping. Not for a lawyer, not for success. For a woman whose hands had finally been seen. I cried openly. Daniel cried too. And in that moment, something inside me finally healed. Not because strangers applauded, not because people admired me, because my son was no longer looking away. He was standing beside me, proud. The little boy who once promised to take care of me had finally kept his promise. And for the first time in my life, I no longer wanted to hide my hands. Because every scar carried a story. Every wrinkle carried a sacrifice. And every damaged finger had built a future. Not only for my son, but perhaps for me as well. 6 months after the conference in Chicago, my life became quieter. Not smaller, not lonelier, simply quieter. The kind of quiet that arrives after a storm has finally passed. Spring returned to Ohio. The garden behind my house began waking up again. The roses bloomed beside the fence. The old maple tree outside my kitchen window filled with green leaves, and every morning sunlight stretched across the table where Daniel once did his homework. For the first time in many years, I stopped wearing gloves. It happened accidentally. I was standing in line at the grocery store when I realized my hands were uncovered. The scars showed plainly beneath the fluorescent lights. The old Sierra would have hidden them. The old Sierra would have folded them beneath her purse. The old Sierra would have apologized for them, but something inside me had changed. A woman behind me noticed my fingers. She hesitated. "What happened to your hands?" For 40 years that question had carried embarrassment. Now it carried something else. I smiled. "I used them." She smiled back, and that was enough. Daniel visited nearly every month. Sometimes he came alone. Sometimes Olivia came with him. Sometimes they stayed for only a weekend. Sometimes longer. But he always arrived carrying groceries, flowers, or something unnecessary that I scolded him for buying. One Saturday morning, I found him repairing my back porch. I stood in the doorway. "What are you doing? The step is loose." "It's been loose for years." He looked up. "Exactly." I laughed. "When did you learn this?" "I watched videos." "You watched videos to fix a step." "I also watched videos to make lasagna." I smiled. "The lasagna was terrible." He grinned. "I know." Small moments became precious. Coffee together, long drives, old photographs, stories we had never shared. One evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. Daniel held one of my hands. He did that often now. Not carefully, not out of pity. Naturally. The way children once hold their parents' hands without thinking. He looked at my fingers. "Do they still hurt?" "Sometimes." He nodded. "Mine do too." I smiled. "You're getting old." He laughed. "No." He looked down. "I think I finally understand." I waited. "My hands hurt after a few days of work." He turned toward me. "You worked for 40 years." I looked toward the sunset. "I had good reasons." He squeezed my fingers. "I know." There were still difficult days. Healing does not erase the past. Sometimes I remembered the country club, the laughter, the silence. Daniel remembered it too. One evening he asked, "Will you ever forgive me completely?" I thought about the question, because forgiveness had already happened in many ways. It happened every time he called, every visit, every meal, every conversation, every time he reached for my hands. But some wounds leave scars, and scars are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of healing. "I already have." He looked surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "When?" I smiled. "The first time you truly looked at me." His eyes filled. Because that was the truth. I never needed perfection. Only sight. Only understanding. Several months later, Daniel and Olivia became engaged. He called me first. Before anyone. "Mom?" "Yes." I asked her. "And?" She said yes. I laughed and cried at the same time. "When's the wedding?" "We haven't decided." There was a long pause. Then he said something I never expected. "I want you to walk with me." I frowned. "What?" "Before the ceremony." My voice softened. Daniel, I spent too many years walking ahead of you. Tears filled my eyes. I think it's time we walk together. The wedding took place the following autumn. Small, elegant, family and close friends. Nothing like the country club. Nothing like that terrible evening. Before the ceremony began, Daniel waited outside. He wore a dark suit. His hair showed a little more gray now. When he saw me, he smiled. "You look beautiful." I laughed. "You're becoming very good at this." He offered his arm, and together we walked. Not mother behind son, not son ahead of mother. Side by side. Several guests noticed my hands. I saw them looking, but I no longer cared, because Daniel never let go. At the reception, he raised his glass. Everyone became quiet. He looked at Olivia, then at me. "There are two women responsible for everything good in my life." My heart tightened. He continued. "One chose to spend her life with me." He smiled at Olivia. "The other spent her life building me." His voice trembled. He looked directly at my hands. "I once thought success meant becoming someone important." He shook his head. "I was wrong." The room remained silent. "Success is becoming someone your mother can be proud of." People cried. Olivia cried. I cried. Daniel walked toward me. He gently lifted my hands. The same hands. The burned hands. The broken hands. The hands that once embarrassed him. The hands that had worked 3 jobs. The hands that survived fire. The hands that built his future. He kissed them, right there, in front of everyone. And suddenly, I remembered the little boy who once kissed a burn on my finger and said, "Now it'll feel better." Some promises take decades to keep. A year later, I still live in the same house. The porch is repaired. The garden grows. The kitchen remains small. I never moved into a blue house. And honestly, I no longer need one, because I finally understand something I spent years forgetting. These hands were never ugly. They were never frightening. They were never something to hide. Every scar is a memory. Every wrinkle is a sacrifice. Every ache is proof that I stayed through abandonment, stayed through poverty, stayed through pain, stayed through fire, stayed for my son. Sometimes when Daniel visits, we sit quietly on the porch. He holds my hand. Neither of us speaks. We no longer need many words. Because after 40 years of pain, sacrifice, and silence, my son finally understands what those hands built. They built his life. They rebuilt our family. And in the end, they also rebuilt me. Life lessons and message. There are people all around us carrying invisible stories. A scar, a wrinkle, a tired face, rough hands, bent fingers. Too often, we see only the surface. We measure people by their clothes, careers, homes, or bank accounts. We forget that many of the people who built our lives did so quietly, without applause, without recognition, and without asking for anything in return. Parents often hide their struggles because they want their children to dream freely. They carry fear so their children can feel safe. They work through pain so their children can have opportunities. Sometimes those sacrifices become invisible, but invisible does not mean unimportant. Sierra's story reminds us that love is not always gentle. Sometimes love is exhausted hands. Sometimes love is working 3 jobs. Sometimes love is choosing pain so someone else can have a better future. And children grow up. They become successful, busy, distracted. Sometimes they forget. But it is never too late to look again. Never too late to ask questions. Never too late to say, "I see you now." Forgiveness does not erase the past. Healing does not remove scars, but understanding can rebuild what silence destroys. If you still have someone who sacrificed for you, tell them, call them, visit them, hold their hand, because one day those hands may no longer be there. And if you are the one who sacrificed, please remember this: your scars are not signs of weakness. They are evidence of love. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Has someone in your life sacrificed quietly for you? Is there a parent, grandparent, or loved one you wish you could thank today? Please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about family forgiveness and second chances mean something to you, I hope you'll stay subscribed and join me again. Because sometimes the strongest hands are the ones the world never notices.